Hello, everybody. Good morning. Thank you so much for tuning in and welcome to China's Digital Consumer 2020 webinar series. My name is Maxine Renfrew. I'm the Service Delivery Executive here at CBBC, and today I'm joined by Adam Knight, co-founder at Tong. You should be able to see him on the webcam here. So I hope everybody had a really great Easter weekend and are feeling relaxed and refreshed for the short week ahead despite the circumstances. Before we go any further, I just want to do some quick housekeeping, just to make sure that you can all hear and see me. So you should have a webinar panel kind of like this on your screen. If everybody could click the virtual hands up button, that will let me know that you can hear me. It's just this one right here. Okay, I see one hand going up and two. Yeah, okay, great. I've also circled here our questions box, so please do send your questions over. We're going to do a 10-minute Q&A at the end. Adam is presenting without slides today, so it's going to be hopefully much more engaging than our other webinars. But please do send your questions across. We will address them at the end. Yeah, just type them in and fire them across. And even if you think they're not completely relevant to today's content, Tong Digital, they cover a huge amount of industries and sectors and e-commerce platforms, so I'm sure Adam will be able to answer your questions. Very quickly as well, an introduction to CBBC. So CBBC, for those of you who don't know, we are the China-Britain Business Council. We are the leading body supporting UK-China trade. Here in the UK, we have offices across the country covering all regions and industry sectors. Here on the consumer team, we support the agriculture, food and drink, and the retail sector. Over in China, we have a bigger team, actually. We have 13 offices across the country. These are all in the first-tier cities, that's Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. And we also have offices in second and third-tier cities as well. Over there, our wonderful China team are on the ground, supporting UK businesses breaking into the China market or developing their China market. As I said, this is our webinar series. We have a lot of content in the pipeline. I just wanted to pick out a few upcoming webinars. So towards the end of April, we will be talking about how to move your brand online after the COVID outbreak. That's with Redfern Digital. And into May, we'll be talking about cross-border social commerce. That's with Connect Plus. And towards the end of May, we will have a slightly different presentation on B2B digital marketing, and that's with Crayfish. There are also a couple where the registration links aren't quite up yet. So next Tuesday, we have a webinar from Snapdragon Monitoring. This is also focused on coronavirus and how brands can protect themselves online. That's at the exact same time, 9:30 a.m, and the registration link should be up by the end of today. And finally, our speaker for today. So Adam co-founded Tong in 2014. He has a background in Chinese studies and internet studies, both from the University of Oxford. And today we're going to be talking about KOL marketing, all of the challenges which companies might face, and it's going to be very case study heavy. So very excited to hand you over to Adam, and welcome.
Thank you, Maxine. I'm also hoping that everybody can hear me. I'm just going to assume that you can and not dwell too much on that. As Maxine said, I am going to do something a little bit different today. I'm not going to use any slides. There's a reason for that, which is that I don't know about you guys, but I've been to quite a few of these. I've delivered quite a few of these, and I find that actually what tends to happen is that if you have slides, everybody tends to just look at those, or even worse, look at Facebook or Twitter or something instead. And actually, I think that this kind of webinar format when you're at home works much better if you think of it more as kind of a podcast. So I am going to talk for half an hour, 40 minutes or so. We'll see how long I can ramble on for. Then we'll take some questions. As Maxine said, if there's anything you've got specifically to talk about with influencer marketing, but of course anything else China digital related, then do let me know. A little bit of an introduction, first of all, for those of you that don't know me. As Maxine said, I'm Adam. I'm one of the co-founders here at Tong. Tong is a full-service Chinese social commerce agency headquartered here in London. What I mean by social commerce is that everything that we do sits at that kind of crucial intersection between content, influencer marketing, and how those things impact sales, both online and offline. I'm obviously not talking to you from our offices today, but from my flat here in Camberwell. We've been actually doing a whole bunch of webinars ourselves over the last couple of weeks, which have been a really nice way of engaging with all of you guys stuck at home. My personal background is I've been kind of living, working, studying in China for the last almost 10 years now, academia, journalism, business. Tong was started 6 years ago now, as Maxime said, and in that time we've helped about 70 or 80 brands now of all different shapes and sizes to enter and scale up in the market. So today's topic, influencer marketing. It's a big one, it's an important one. It's one that I think makes up the bread and butter of what we do over at Tong. Broadly speaking, I want to cover 5 different things today. So the first is the size of the pie. What are we actually talking about? How big is the influencer industry? Then we're going to go and dive into some of the kind of the terms, the terminology. You know, you hear all these abbreviations, KOLs, KOCs. We'll dive into some of those. Then we're going to look at some case studies, how our brands using influencers. We're then going to look at how our brands using influencers badly, and some of the examples we can draw from of influencer marketing gone wrong. And then finally, as we always like to kind of wrap things up with, some practical steps that you can take away today and start implementing in your influencer marketing from day one. So let's get started. What are we talking about when we're talking about influencers? Well, what we're certainly not talking about anymore are kind of amateur productions, you know, the kind of single beauty blogger sat in their bedroom broadcasting to a few friends. Yes, of course, that still exists, but broadly speaking, when we think about influencer marketing in China, we're talking about tens of thousands of professional creators making a living from an industry that until just a few years ago simply didn't exist. The biggest players these days are no longer kind of, you know, one-man shows, but rather teams of 30, 40, even 50 people producing content, managing communities, handling sales and logistics. And I think the best example of the way that the industry has developed over the last few years is if you look at some of these big influencer houses, I guess there's no other real word for it. So best example is a company called Ruhan or Rune, which is essentially this kind of one-stop shop for influencer work. Think of it as a kind of warehouse, right? And on the upper floor of the warehouse, you walk down these corridors, and off the corridor you have dozens of different individual booths, individual rooms, and if you peer into those, you'll find an influencer with probably 30 or 40 smartphones in front of them, all broadcasting to different platforms. And if you go downstairs, what you'll find is a kind of factory floor of different influencer related activities. So some might be handling social media engagement. There'll be teams that are packaging products and selling them off. There are then teams that are producing new products. There are teams that are engaging in research and development. What you have is this kind of closed ecosystem all within one building, all catering to the influencer marketing industry, so that a brand can go in and not only engage with an influencer, but also sell through that influencer and ultimately kind of develop new products through that influencer and through their audiences as well. It's kind of like the Ford assembly line in the era of late stage capitalism. So what we now have are these kind of big players in influencer marketing in China that are bringing in record results and record payments as a result. I think probably one of the best known examples is this guy Li Jiaqi, the kind of lipstick king of China. He broke all records on Singles Day. I think this is Singles Day 2018 now, when he sold 15,000 lipsticks in just 5 minutes through live streaming. That same year, he reported an annual income of about 10 million renminbi. Again, another great example, Zhang Dai, fashion designer, online influencer. She made $46 million last year. And to put that into some perspective, because these are obviously mind-blowing numbers, Kim Kardashian only made $45.5 million last year. So Zhang Dai even bigger than Kim Kardashian. And this webinar today actually has fallen at a really great time, because last week we actually saw a record-breaking influencer collaboration. Luo Yonghao, who is a smartphone manufacturer, he started a phone brand called Smartersan a few years ago. Actually failed, but he has become this kind of online celebrity. And he ran a live stream last week with 48 million people who viewed it. He sold about $15 million in about 2 hours. So this gives you an idea of just the kind of dizzying heights of influencer marketing, the kind of grotesque size that it has grown to. It's an industry that now totals about $43 billion US. There are about 20,000 influencers on Weibo alone who have over 1 million followers. In a recent survey last year, there was this was of young people born after 1990. 54% of respondents said that they wanted to be an influencer when they grew up. So, I mean, is it any wonder given the numbers, right? So what are some of the reasons for this kind of rise in influencer marketing and its kind of real kind of takeoff in the market? Well, in my mind, there are kind of 3 core factors here. And there are probably a few more, but I think 3 that really kind of hit home why influencer marketing has got to the place that it has. The first is that China is not only a mobile first market, but actually a mobile only market. Something like, I think it's 98%, 97, 98% of all internet usage in China is done through a smartphone device. And China has in many ways kind of leapfrogged the desktop era and gone straight to mobile. And what that means is that it's 2 different things. One, users are much more used to consuming content in kind of short, snappy, palm of your hand formats. They don't want big clunky websites. They don't want to have to click between different things. They don't want to have to go on these big kind of treasure hunts to be able to find your brand and find how to purchase it. They want it all in one place. On the flip side, what smartphones have done is they've basically held a microphone and held a webcam up to 1 billion people. So you have these kind of huge numbers of content creators now that didn't exist a few years ago. Young people that are looking for ways to express themselves, looking for ways to make money in a lot of cases. And so you've seen this kind of abundance of short, snappy content and advertising models that are very much geared towards social media. The second factor is the kind of platformatization of the online society in China. Very much tied into this kind of mobile first, mobile only phenomenon that I mentioned. What you've got now are these kind of mega ecosystems within China digital. So Wechat is the best example of this. These are platforms that are all singing, all dancing. They've kind of got everything within one place. So again, this comes back to what I was saying just now about users not wanting to kind of jump between different platforms, but rather having all of that in one place. And this again really lends itself to influencers where you can not only discover a product, but also buy that within one closed ecosystem through social commerce. And then the third factor, which is a slightly more kind of cultural one, is the emphasis on word of mouth marketing in China. China, more than any other market, has a reliance on this kind of peer-to-peer horizontal form of making opinions that you just don't really see as much in other slightly more developed economies. So for example, I think it's 68% of consumers in China will actively seek out user reviews when making a purchasing decision, as opposed to about 40% globally, 40% in Europe and the US, so quite significantly higher in China. I think part of the reason for that is that this kind of Gen Z demographic in China are kind of, they're kind of coming of age now, and they're looking for more authentic brand experiences. They're looking to people that they have some kind of affinity with, they're not so interested in this kind of top-down vertical forms of control of media consumption anymore, but rather seeking recommendations from their peers and those around them. Hence the rise of influencer marketing. So just to kind of dive into some of the different types of influencers and this kind of taxonomy of terms, so to speak. When we are talking with brands about how to kind of get into influencer marketing and how to start that journey and how to optimize that journey, what we're really talking about are kind of 5 different kinds of influencers. And this is the first thing I think everybody has to understand, is that it's not a kind of one-size-fits-all model in China. So the first level are the ones that everybody's heard of. It's the ones that I was just talking about now, these so-called Wanghong or internet reds. These kind of top KOLs, key opinion leaders that are extremely powerful, extremely influential, and are present in basically every single case study of Chinese marketing done well. And even if these influencers don't directly sell products, they have the ability to heavily influence purchasing intents in China. Now, these Wang Hong are right at the top of the spectrum. We just talked about some numbers before, and that gives you an indication of the size of the market and like I said, the kind of grossly inflated top end of the scale here. And for most of you listening today, and for most of the brands in the UK, and actually most of the brands in Europe, these Wang Hong, these kind of top level influencers, are going to be a little bit further down the line, probably out of the price range for kind of entry level influencer campaigns. So then you start to look down this kind of curve a little bit to see what other kinds of Chinese influencers are there, who can I engage, who can I leverage to reach new audiences. So the second category of influencer are so-called experts, Darren. So these are influencers that have expertise in a particular field, a particular product type, particular industry. They have a lot of knowledge about certain trends, certain products, and they can have very strong influence on netizens, on online purchasing. And their specialist nature makes them much more convincing compared with other influencers. So this has become quite an interesting way of getting into influence marketing for products that have quite niche audiences. It might be that you're a health brand, or anything to do with mother and baby, or anything that's kind of that has quite a niche kind of collective following. So some examples of brands that we've worked with. One brand that this has worked really nicely for actually is a company called Amalgam, which make collectible model cars. Very nice. You know, talking kind of £8,000-10,000 each for a model Ferrari. It's a niche market, right? You know, not that many people are in the market for that kind of product. So what did we do? We kind of worked with these experts, worked with these kind of micro influencers within these very small closed communities who would talk about this product, not only because it was useful for us because they were, they had access to those communities, but actually because they really loved the product and they really kind of engaged with it. And those kinds of campaigns have been some of our most successful over the years. The way that you find these influencers is slightly different to the larger ones. It's much more education focused. There's a lot more kind of, I guess kind of, you have to kind of really bring that influencer along for the ride with you. And the platforms that you use also tend to be different. So we tend to use platforms like Zhihu, so Z-H-I-H-U. It's a kind of Q&A, Quora style platform where influencers, particularly within mother and baby, anything to do with children, anything to do with collectibles, tend to spend a lot of time. And they'll be sharing advice, getting into these kind of community discussions about how best to do parenting, what's the latest edition of this particular collectible item, so on and so forth. Similarly, you can transplant that same idea to bigger platforms like Wechat, but turn to slightly more niche functionality within that. So when most people talk about Wechat marketing, most people talk about Wechat influencer marketing, what they think of is working with an influencer, get them to post that out, and then drive traffic towards your official account. But actually, one of the most cost-effective ways to do influencer marketing on a platform like Wechat is to look at forming Wechat communities of kind of 500 followers or less within a small space, seed content into that, and get people discussing in a kind of quite organic way, so that it becomes, again, much more peer-led, much more horizontal, rather than it just be a kind of forced, almost like PR, press release essentially, which is how a lot of brands tend to think of influencers, rather than really leveraging the power of their voice, which is essentially what you're paying for. One really great example of a brand that's done this incredibly well is Perfect Diary. Now, Perfect Diary, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that most of you listening probably haven't heard of Perfect Diary, but Perfect Diary is the hottest beauty brand in China at the moment. They have shot from nothing over the last year and a half, 2 years, to overtake the likes of L'Oreal, Lancôme, Estee Lauder, you name it, they're kind of nipping at the heels. The product itself, I don't think is anything particularly special. Okay, they're much more localized. It's a domestic Chinese brand, so they get the consumer a little bit more. But the way that they've really managed to steal the march on some of this competition is through very targeted influencer engagements within these kind of small expert communities, as well as using the next category of influencer, which are kind of micro KOLs. So this is the third category. So micro influencers are the kind of up and coming guys. These are people that they haven't quite reached the heights of the Wang Hong and the top KOLs, but they're on their way. And as a result, they tend to have much smaller, much more targeted, more niche communities focused around particular product types often. Follower count typically, less than 1 million. And they tend to be a little bit cheaper and a lot more kind of ready to work with brands on a collaborative basis rather than just being spoon-fed content. These guys are hard to find because obviously everybody's looking for them. But if you do strike one, then that's a relationship to hold on to. The fourth category are, and these final two categories are, I think, some of the more interesting ones, I think, to brands that are listening. Fourth category are e-commerce KOLs. So this is an interesting pivot we've seen in social commerce over the last couple of years that I think is due to two factors, really. One is due to the technology and that selling things through social media has become easier. The second thing is that influencers are looking for ways to differentiate themselves and are becoming more entrepreneurial. These are business people in their own rights. And so these e-commerce influencers are top-level influencers, not always that big, who have said, you know what, I'm sick and tired of being paid a fee just to post on behalf of a brand and then deliver them millions of dollars worth of results. Do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to set up my own store. Brands are going to list their products on my store. I'm not going to take any fee from them, but I will take 25, 30, 35% of any sales that I generate. And this is a model that has really taken off, I think, in the last 6 to 12 months. And you've seen some really, really great examples of influencers that are doing this well. I won't steal my own thunder because I was going to talk about one of these influencers in a couple of minutes' time, so we'll come back to this. The final category are KOCs. Now, well done to anybody who's listening who's heard of a KOC before, because this really is a very new thing, just from the last 6 months or so. KOC stands for Key Opinion Consumer, as opposed to Key Opinion Leader. So these are an emerging focus of marketers' strategies in China. Think of KOCs as essentially the kind of evangelist for your brand. These are people that have bought your product. You've not gifted it to them, or you might have seeded it to them, but the point is they've got it in their hands, and they love it, and they're posting about it, and they're writing reviews about it, and they are basically pushing that out to their friends, to their followers. And this is, like I said, a kind of new emerging model of influencer marketing, and one that I think is going to be to watch over the next few months and years. So what are some of the different ways that brands can use influencers? Now we've talked about all these different categories. Again, in my mind, there are 4 ways that brands can approach influencer marketing, 4, I guess, key strategies. And something, again, I'll come back to in a few minutes' time, is that I think the number one thing that you as a brand need to ask yourself before you jump into influencer marketing is what's my goal here? What's my outcome? Just generating kind of generic PR, influence marketing is not really for you. You need to have kind of a real kind of end point here, an end goal. And in my mind, there are 4 things that you could aim for realistically here. And these are, of course, not mutually exclusive, but it tends to help if you've got one particular focus. So the first is the most basic, storytelling. Building up that awareness, communicating who you are, what you're about, what you're trying to achieve in the market. In my mind, by far and away, the best example of a foreign brand doing this in China in the last couple of years has been Airbnb. So Airbnb has been ramping up its efforts in China since about 2017, when they first got into the market, through very, very strong localized content, including a really, really great Chinese name for anybody that can speak or read Chinese. They've had some very, very powerful influencer collaborations, and especially robust presence on platforms like Weibo using particular hashtags. The way that they've kind of really, I guess, made themselves relevant to a local audience, which has been quite tough because there are at least 3 or 4 Airbnb competitors in China, or at least there were before Airbnb really upped their game. To make themselves relevant on a local level, they predominantly focused on influencers, and basically kind of said, do you know what, you take the principles of Airbnb and you give them your spin, and you create content for us that's within kind of broad parameters, but we really want you to tell your own stories. Tell us what it means, what does travel mean to you? What does that authentic travel experience mean to you? And really kind of push that forward under the kind of Airbnb branding. It was things like they really started to challenge some societal norms. So they did a Chinese New Year campaign where they encouraged millennials to not completely abandon kind of family orientation that Chinese festivals have, but rather than going to see their parents, it was, why don't you bring your family with you on a kind of authentic, localized travel experience abroad or within China somewhere. And they produced some really beautiful video content, lots of hashtags, all that kind of thing to go with it. COVID-19 has really kind of compounded the power of storytelling for brands, and the monetization factor has kind of plummeted slightly for influencers over the last couple of months, but it's become a really, really powerful way for brands that want to still reach audiences without being too commercial, too opportunistic, not pushing particular products, but really kind of communicate, we feel you, we get the market, we are in touch with our Chinese consumers. And so this storytelling aspect, if it wasn't important before, or wasn't as important before, has become probably the #1 way that brands are using influencers at the moment. The second outcome that you might have with influencer marketing is product development. Now, this is something that I think a lot of brands overlook, but it's something that I think any brand that's new to the market, this should probably be the first thing that they're looking at doing, which is really just testing whether your product and your brand is even right for the market before you invest too much in that space. So what a lot of influencers will do now is kind of loop in the product development process into their whole bit. What they might do is, in a very kind of targeted way, they might hold a competition or hold a free product giveaway for certain, for their communities, for their followers. This kind of gives an air of exclusivity, but it also allows you to get some really, really good feedback on whether your product type, whether the packaging, whether the naming, whether the customer service, all this kind of thing is ready for the Chinese market before you really scale things up. Of course, the logical next step from that is that influencers then themselves start to suggest, oh, have you thought about this particular flavor, or changing this up, or developing your product in this particular direction? And this becomes super, super interesting and useful feedback, the kind of stuff that you would pay tens of thousands of pounds for to do through focus groups or through expert interviews. And this is a way that you can get some really quick, live, actionable market feedback in quite a short time frame. So really, really good way of using influencers. The third route for influencers is probably the most obvious one, which is reaching new audiences. But you'd be surprised how few brands really are making the most of this. Again, coronavirus has pushed some brands to do this perhaps before they would have liked to. The last couple of months have been big months for Louis Vuitton and Prada in China. They obviously were hit quite substantially back in January and February by coronavirus, knocking out their sales in China, and subsequently have been knocked out of business here as well, what with Italy being on lockdown, and France as well. And what they have done to try and generate interest and kind of get whatever sales they can do is turn to things like live streaming and using influencers. And these are brands that would never have done this before. It just wasn't part of their wheelhouse. It wasn't part of how they operate. But what coronavirus has done, and I think what generally market trends are showing, is that influencer marketing is becoming a surefire way to reach new audiences, reach new communities of users that you wouldn't turn to otherwise. Now, the way that you do this is not just through which influencers you use, but which platforms you use. I won't go into too much detail here because it's slightly off topic, but what you're seeing are platforms like Red or Douyin or Kuaishou are really kind of stealing a bit of a march on the more established players like Wechat or Weibo in terms of their ability for brands to leverage those platforms to basically reach new audiences that aren't so plugged in to the bigger, more established platforms. Like I said, I won't go into too much detail about this. I'm sure there's another CBBC webinar on those kind of platforms. And if there isn't, I'm happy to do one. The fourth and final way that brands can use influencers is, of course, the big one, the one that everybody wants, which is to sell, right? And this is where social commerce has really come into its own over the last couple of years, and it's what we at Tong really pride ourselves on driving and understanding. To give you a couple of examples, the first one I think is one that some of you will have heard of before. It's a little bit of an older, dated example, but I think it's one that still blows people's minds because you know, it's just so outrageous, which is the case of Becky Lee, who is a WeChat influencer who back in, I think it was as long ago as 2017 now, she partnered up with Mini Cooper, and they did 4 weeks worth of beautiful branded content to launch this limited edition car priced at about £30,000 or so, kind of teal colored. They launched this campaign through WeChat, and within 5 minutes, all 100 £30,000 cars had sold out. So this shows a couple of different things. One, it shows the power of WeChat and the, you know, the willingness of Chinese consumers to pay for quite large items just using mobile payments without ever actually having seen them. But of course, it really speaks to the power of influence. It's the fact that 100 people, presumably more, were willing to buy this car just based on the kind of recommendations and the content that this influencer was putting out. A slightly more recent example, which comes back to the model I was speaking about before in terms of e-commerce marketing, e-commerce KOLs, is Tao Liang, or more commonly known as Mr. Bags. Mr. Bags is a phenomenon. He is a blogger. He blogs about handbags, obviously, and he's basically worked with every single major luxury handbag brand and lots of small ones as well over the last few years. And he really is a kind of goldmine of case studies when it comes to influencer marketing done well. One of his more recent collaborations with Tod's, this was actually the third collaboration he'd done with Tod's last June, saw him kind of collaborate on making a new bag. Again, this is the third time he's done this for them. They made 320 of these bags, each priced at about $2,500. And they sold out. He basically, the way that the model that they worked with was he sold them through his own WeChat mini program shop called Bao Shop, Mr. Bags, Bao being bag, and he took a commission for all the sales, and they generated about $700,000 US within a matter of minutes. So again, it gives you an example of just the ridiculous scale of all of this. I always like to talk not only about some of these kind of really great examples of brands that have done amazing things with influencer marketing, but I think it's useful to also cover some of the not so successful examples, because it's easy to get carried away, right, in thinking about you know, how, you know, this pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, when in reality, for every campaign that works, there are 20, 30 that fall flat on their face, probably. And in some cases, these campaigns really, well, they not only fall flat on their face, but they explode in your face. So just to kind of run through a couple of these, basically to scare you, you know, I think, again, there are a few different ways, a few different trends that we're seeing in influencer marketing that brands need to be aware of when jumping into bed with these influencers. So the first thing is Porty Diligence. So I think one of the downfalls of a lot of companies when they think about working with influencers, they just don't do their homework. They get lured in by some flashy vanity metrics. You know, this influencer has, oh, they have 1 million followers, oh, they're getting this much engagement, without really kind of doing much of a deep dive. So the first thing you really need to do is look at fake data. This is a real kind of a real spectre, I guess, within influencer marketing. It's a lot of false information, a lot of fake information out there. And again, I think just a really quick example of this in action. Back in December, there was a minor scandal in China of a fashion vlogger, Yu Han. She had almost 4 million Weibo followers. And she was contracted by a brand that was looking to launch their new product, which alleviates period pains. And on the face of it, the campaign was a huge success. Within the first hour, her video had 3.5 million views, it had thousands of comments. 50% of the comments were saying, oh my God, this is amazing. I've bought the product, really looking forward to receiving it. This is going to change my life. The reality was that the brand, of course, didn't need to do much homework to find out, whether this was rubbish or not. They just looked in their website back end. Not only did they have 0 orders, but they actually had 0 store visits, 0 click-throughs from the social media. So what had happened? Well, this was obviously fake. It was fake data. It was just bots. It was all paid for. And this vlogger, Yuhan, came under quite a lot of criticism for this, obviously. And this is something that brands deal with all the time when doing influencer marketing. It really is the bane of everybody's existence. And we'll come on to in a few minutes' time exactly how you can mitigate some of these issues. Very much tied into this is due diligence. So another great example of this is Lancôme, who did they did a campaign with Denise He. Denise He is she's a very famous singer, Cantonese pop singer, and she was contracted by Lancôme to do a concert in mainland China a couple of years ago. Now she's from Hong Kong. She's very pro Hong Kong and anti kind of Chinese power in Hong Kong, mainland Chinese power. And so this concert in mainland China was boycotted by Chinese fans and picked up by the nationalist press in China and what have you. So what did Lancôme do? They tried to get control of the situation. They cancelled the concert. Of course, what that meant was Denise He and all of her fans back in Hong Kong were not too happy about this. So they also then boycotted the brand. So you had consumers in Hong Kong, consumers in mainland China, both boycotting the brand. It all ended with Denise He actually staging her own protest concert in Hong Kong against Lancôme. So in Hong Kong against Lancôme. So this was a really good example of a brand that just hadn't really thought about some of the cultural sensitivities associated with certain influencers. Another interesting trend I think we're seeing is influencer fatigue. Li Jiaqi, this lipstick king I mentioned before, had a pretty disastrous incident at the end of last year, November, December time, when he did a live stream with a kind of non-stick pan. I don't know why he was doing this. He's a lipstick guy, but he was, selling kitchen utensils. And it's supposed to be non-stick, and of course, the perils of doing something live, it then proved that it wasn't non-stick. And this kind of generated a new wave of discussion in China about the authenticity of influencers. Do they believe what they're selling? Are they really are they just doing this for the money? The answer is obviously yes, but this was somewhat of a kind of turning point in the minds of Chinese consumers and the kinds of discussions going on about this. One final example of influencer marketing gone wrong, and this really is a messy one, but it's relevant because it was just from last month actually, is this kind of rising toxic fandom that you're seeing in China. So this is an influencer called Xiao Zhang, who is he's a singer, rapper, all-round superstar. He has a very, very large and very loyal fan base who produce all sorts of kind of fan fiction and fan content, and a small kind of subsect of his fan base, his kind of LGBTQ fan base, produced some erotic fan fiction where they basically wrote this story of him having a homosexual relationship with another a very well-known singer in China. There's no evidence that Xiao Zhang himself is gay, but this was a kind of like fan fiction essentially. And a Weibo user posted this on Weibo, and this did not go down well with the rest of Xiao Zhang's fans. China is still quite a homophobic country in large, and his kind of hardcore fans took it very personally for some reason, that he was being portrayed as this gay icon, even though for all they knew, he is actually gay, but that seemed to be besides the point. So what did they do? They reported this Weibo user and the blog that this fan fiction was hosted on to the Chinese government, who then promptly not only deleted that individual piece of fan fiction, but they deleted the entire website that it was hosted on. Now, this website was home not to kind of homoerotic fan fiction and stories and content for a lot of China's LGBTQ community. And this is a community, they don't have much chance to kind of share their experiences. So this was quite an important website, but it got deleted by the Chinese government. So they're obviously very upset about that. So what did they do? They then, this is coming around full circle to the point of the story here, they launched a boycott against all of the brands that Xiaojian works with. So Estee Lauder, Piaget, these were brands that back in Singles Day in November were generating, I think Piaget or Estee Lauder generated about $1.5 million worth of sales through Xiaojian Singles Day last year, and they now found themselves boycotted because of all of this toxic fandom. So this really to say that influencer marketing is becoming its own beast. It's really kind of taking off in a direction that I think is completely unpredictable for most brands out in the market. Having said that, this kind of unpredictability is certainly one side of the story. On the other side, there are, of course, some very practical steps that you as a brand can take to mitigate some of these risks and to make sure that you are delivering good quality campaigns. Now, I know I'm running a little bit over here, but this, I guess, is probably the most useful bit. So I'll run through this quickly, but then obviously if we've got any questions, we can dive into a bit more detail afterwards. So how do you find the right influencer? This is not so easy, but again, there are certain kind of key steps I think that any brand can run through to make sure that you're ticking all the right boxes. The first thing is what I mentioned before: set your goals. What is good going to look like? What are you trying to get out of this? I think again there are kind of three main ways that you want to think about here. Is it just to drive brand awareness? So are you looking for engagement, sign-ups, new followers? Is it about generating feedback in the form of product development? So that you might seed some product amongst your followers, or is it to sell? So in which case you've got to ask yourself, do I have the infrastructure in place to be able to do that? Do I have a Wechat store set up? Do I have a Red store set up? Am I going to sell through influencers on their particular platforms? Once you've set your goals and what your KPIs are, you then want to decide on what's the model. Okay, so these three ways that I just mentioned, each one has its own model that goes with it. So if you're trying to build awareness, the model is going to be simply paid. It's a cash game. Influence marketing in China, again, more so than any other international market, is all about money. Okay. Now, influencer fees can range anywhere from a few £100s for the kind of bottom level influencer up to millions of dollars for those kind of very, very top influencers. So it really is kind of the length of a piece of string. It's hard to put it, and people ask all the time, what's the average price of an influencer? And it's, there is no answer to that question because it varies by industry, it varies by size, it varies in terms of what you're trying to achieve. It also varies depending on your negotiating skills. Having, to give you some estimate, a typical influencer campaign for a SME here in the UK going out to China will probably range somewhere in between £10,000 to £15,000 to work with a handful of influencers, and that's kind of the bottom level of the scale. Anything lower than that, and your money is never quite going to kind of get too far, unless you go for one of these other models. So, awareness, paid. If you're looking for product feedback or brand feedback, you might look at something like a product giveaway. So this is where you seed product to a particular influencer, get them to blog about it, get them to build some awareness around it, or it might be you give them a batch of product and you get them to then run their own competition, passing things on to their followers. So again, this is a really good way of getting up some initial content, particularly if you're wanting to go down the e-commerce route. Let's say you want to set up a store on Red or even set up a store on JD or Tmall. One of the first things those companies are going to do is look at what's this brand's existing presence in China. Is anybody talking about them at all? Because if they're an unknown brand, they're not going to be interested. So this kind of product seeding is a really good way of getting those first 50 people, first 100 people talking about you, so that when somebody plugs in your brand name into a social media platform or into a Chinese search engine, there's something there. There are images of the product in people's hands, people are talking about you. And so it's a really good way of just getting that initial traction. So feedback, product giveaway. The third model, selling, often the model here will be a commission-based model. So this depends on exactly how you're doing things. You might be working on consignment. So if you don't have the infrastructure in place, so having products sit within an influencer's own warehouse or bedroom or whatever, and they then send things out from there. Or it might be a referral model where the influencer pushes people to your own website or your own e-commerce store. Both ways of doing things will work on commission, so a percentage of sales, and this could be anywhere in the region of 20 to 35% or so. So once you've set your campaign goals, once you've decided on your model, the next is to actually start looking for some influencers, right? So first thing you want to do is draw up some shortlists, do your homework, throw the net wide, get as many influencers on this list as possible. There are platforms that will help you with this. Probably the most established one is a platform called Park.lu, L-U. And these are good ways of getting a long list and a short list of influencers. You can filter down by industry, filter down by size, by price, get a list of 20 influencers, people that might be interested in working with you, and then take it to the next stage, which is your due diligence. Now, this is something, as I mentioned before, that I think a lot of brands don't do enough of, but it's probably the most important step in all of this, which is figuring out, are these influencers actually right for me, or am I about to spend £10,000 on somebody that's worked with my direct competitor before, or whose style doesn't fit in with my brand guidelines, or just isn't interesting and isn't interested in the industry that I'm working in. So due diligence is important. Unfortunately, there's no shortcut to it. It's a manual job. You've got to do your homework. You just got to get in there, get stuck into the content and see what they're doing. But vitally important. The next step is negotiation, arguably also very important. Now, never take a list price as it's written. There's a lot that goes into influencer pricing, and we could probably do a whole nother webinar just on that. So I'm just going to park that for now. It could be anything from the reputation of your brand, the KPIs that you're looking for, the platform you're using, the format, whether they think that they can take you for a bit of a ride. All of these things will impact the price that you get quoted. The most important thing to bear in mind is that quote is very flexible. Typically speaking, we as an agency, I think because of the experience and the buying power that we have as well, mean that we negotiate prices down by about 50% of what they're initially quoted as. And that gives you some indication as to the I guess the kind of liberties that some of these influencers take with brands. At this negotiation phase, it's also worth thinking not only about price, but a bunch of other things that, again, brands tend to forget about. Things like image rights. After this campaign, do I get use of these images, which for an e-commerce brand is really helpful, because you can use, if you've got a Chinese model using your skincare brand, that's going to be really powerful imagery for you to use on social media, on your own channel, but also on your website as well, those kind of model pictures. Also the duration of posts. If you don't set this in writing, what you can find is that an influencer, you'll pay an influencer a certain amount of money, they'll throw up a post, it'll get a bunch of engagement, 24 hours later they've deleted the post. You want that to stay up for at least a month or so. So after negotiation, you then move on to the collaboration. There's only really one thing to say here when it comes to content production, which is let the influencers do their thing. Don't try and spoon feed content. Let them speak authentically. At the end of the day, that's what you're paying them for. If you wanted to just do a press release and just get out your own talking points, you could have done paid social or work with a PR agency to do that. The reason you're working with influencers comes back to this kind of peer-to-peer trusted voice that I was talking about before. And if you're going to walk all over that, then you've got to ask yourself, why are you doing influencer marketing in the first place? Sure, set some brand guidelines, work with them, get approvals so that you can sign off on things before they go out. But generally speaking, let the influencers do their thing. They know their audiences, they know what works. And ultimately, it's a bit arrogant of you to come in and try and tell them otherwise. The final piece of the puzzle, of course, once all that content's gone out, is monitoring and tracking. This comes back to all of this fake data I was talking about before. It's really important to make sure that you are tracking everything from start to finish. And you can do this with trackable links, trackable QR codes, using kind of clever social CRM software in the back end. and keep an eye out for fake information. What you'll find is that typically influencers will say, oh, it's okay, I'll send you through a data report afterwards, and you'll see how many new followers you got, how many clicks you got. And of course, this can lead to situations, as I described before, with this fashion vlogger you have, basically just faked all of her own information. And what you'll often see is, it's very common, and it's crazy how frequently influencers think they can get away with this. They'll send a screenshot of their social media back end where it says, oh, I got, this many people clicked on it, or this many people did that, and you can tell it's been photoshopped. Like, you can see, like, it's very obvious. So never trust anything that gets sent over. Always ask to see things, for yourself in the back end. Use trackable links, and if they have fake data, refuse payment. I think the only thing that's going to stop the further ballooning of the influencer industry more than it has already kind of grown beyond what is reasonable, is for brands to kind of push back a little bit. Unfortunately, there aren't that many brands that are willing to do that at the moment. So I would definitely kind of advocate for that. So I have talked for far too long now. So I'm just going to wrap things up really, really quickly. Three main takeaways, I guess. First thing, be smart, do your homework, track everything, do your due diligence. The second thing is, don't be afraid to push back and negotiate. At the end of the day, these influencers, they need you as well. This is their income. And those list prices are always going to be far massively exaggerated. So yeah, don't be afraid to kind of push back on that a little bit. And the third thing I think is relevant, particularly in the current situation we're in, which is work with what you've got. Okay, influencer marketing doesn't need to be this huge, big, cannonball into the water, but rather you can dip your toe in little bit by bit, test and learn, seed some product, work with some micro influencers, work on a kind of commission e-commerce model before going for this big level one home. Look at influencers that are based in the UK, because there are at least a couple of dozen mid-sized influencers that work here, and work with your assets that you've got in-house. Some of the most successful campaigns we've run are things like with Wechat Chelsea, for example, where we take influencers based in the UK, take them to their lovely Covent Garden store, do a tea demonstration. Similarly with beauty brands, taking influencers to meet the creators, meet the designers, get under the skin of the brand, all that kind of thing, produce really authentic content. At the end of the day, that's what consumers back in China want to see, right? They want to see. They're buying these foreign brands because they're buying into a kind of aspirational lifestyle, and they want to see where that brand's come from. They want to see the authenticity through the lens of their idols, through the Chinese influencers. So that's that. I'm going to wrap up there. I've spoken for far too long. Sorry, Maxime. And obviously, if you guys got any questions, let me know. Otherwise, you can reach me over email and all of that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. Yes, after this, I will be sending all the follow-up emails so that you can contact Adam if you have any more questions on marketing. Well done on speaking for a solid 50 minutes. That was quite impressive. And I think we covered quite a variety of topics. I see a few questions in the box, so we'll go over these very quickly. We've got about 5 minutes left. First question from Karen. We are a small brand with a good following on Instagram. We know that this is banned in China, but is it a good channel to work with overseas Chinese KOLs or to attract expat Chinese customers in the UK? And have you got any examples of this?
Yes, so Instagram is a nice example of the way that influencer marketing in China is internationalizing. So there are examples of brands that have successfully worked with beauty or fashion bloggers who are Chinese on Instagram. And it really comes back to, I think, my very, very final point that I just made, really, which is work with what you've got already. If you know you've got a strong presence on Instagram, this can be a really nice way of just kind of dipping your toe in the water, getting some initial collaborations. Now, it's not going to be the platform that's going to deliver endless success in the market for the exact reason you just identified. You know, it's banned. It has limited reach. It does have some cachet as being a foreign platform, so it kind of brings with it all of that, the air of something exotic and sophisticated and different and what have you. But what I would advise is that if you're producing really nice content on a platform like Instagram, is to look for the kind of equivalent platform in China, which would be something like Little Red Book. So Little Red Book is very Instagram-like in the kind of content that goes out. It's very Instagram-like in the way that influencers would use it. And actually setting up an account, one, it's free, you don't have to pay anything. And two, you don't need to, you're not going to have to invest a huge amount more in content production. You could even just start with putting stuff out in English and taking the imagery that you're putting out on Instagram and just transplanting that across to Instagram to Red, so Little Red Book. So long and short, yes, good platform to kind of dip your toe in the water, but it's not going to be something that you're going to see massive long-term growth with.
Great, thank you. Second question from Anne Tien. You mentioned about letting influencers get on with their job, and that's about peer trust. But you also mentioned to check for any fake information. So how should we maintain this balance of trusting them?
Yeah. So there's a couple of different things. I mean, there's the fake information bit is, I guess the checking needs to go on either side of the content production. So when I say leave them to do what they do best, I'm referring to content, right? It's the voice, it's the the imagery that they produce, it's the copywriting, that's what they're good at. Now, what you're going to want to make sure beforehand is that you've done your homework in terms of making sure that they're the right brand fit and everything for you, and then the fake data which comes afterwards. So you shouldn't get in the way of the actual content production, but by all means get in the way when it comes to challenging them on, well, did you actually generate this much? There are a couple of different tactics here. The first one, as I mentioned, is trackable links, and this is something that's becoming I think more useful in this kind of social commerce era that we live in. This kind of platformatization I mentioned before, everything within one ecosystem. So that kind of paper trail becomes quite short from point of discovery to point of sale. So particularly if you're working in a platform like Red or Wechat, you can track from one influencer how many people clicked on the link, how many people went to your product page, how many people added to basket, how many people transacted, and that becomes quite a powerful set of data, obviously. The other ways that you can do this are, like I said, ask to get information, access to their back end, which they're usually pretty cagey about for obvious reasons. And the other way you can do it is look at your own data. If they're saying we drove 10,000 people to your Wechat account or something, there's some very quick ways you can check that. You can go in your Wechat backend, and that's when you dive into some of the kind of metrics that are in there. If you can see that of those 10,000, 40% were viewing historic articles, for example, so not your most recent content, then that's a pretty good indicator that this was actually bot activity. That these were paid internet bots that were basically going in and clicking every single one of your old articles. Normal people don't behave in that way, and so you can see there are kind of some kind of fairly low tech ways of challenging your influencers on whether they are actually delivering the goods.
Great. I think we can squeeze in one last question. This is from Dave. So I've heard of a few of the Chinese social channels, Weibo, WeChat, TikTok, and Red. If we're just starting, what would be the best channel for seeding our brand?
Good question. It's going to depend slightly on the product type, but generally speaking, if you're a kind of let's just say you're a retail brand that's selling, it could be beauty, it could be fashion, it could be anything. You're always going to want to move towards an omni-channel approach in China. You're never going to want to rely on one particular platform, and you always need to understand how these different platforms play off each other in the customer journey. So at the heart of any digital strategy in China is always going to be WeChat, and there are some very obvious reasons for that. It is the largest platform in China. It has the highest penetration. It has the kind of content you put out is much richer, much better for storytelling. It has this e-commerce functionality, which means that you can sell within the platform. So it's great, right? It's really exciting. But at the same time, WeChat is not only one of the most exciting platforms to deal on, but it's one of the most frustrating as well. Very, very difficult for new brands, particularly small brands, to actually get any kind of traction on there. Very expensive, very competitive. So that's when you're going to want to look at some other platforms to essentially drive traffic towards WeChat, which is ultimately, all roads lead to WeChat. That's where you're going to want to get people to. So then you would look at platforms like you mentioned Red is a good example. It's a great platform for generating user-generated content. It's a cheap platform to do business on. There are not many requirements in terms of the volume of content that you're producing. So again, if you're a brand that's new to the market, on something like WeChat, you're going to have to invest so much money in producing good quality content, good quality graphic design, influencers, all of that, just to get 100 followers. Whereas on something like Red, you can focus much more in a much more targeted manner on getting people talking about you and not having to worry too much about, oh, I'm spending money with this agency producing content, but rather parking all of that money into influencer work so that you drive that initial awareness and ultimately, like I said, feed people onto the platforms that actually convert, which would be WeChat. And there are a bunch of other platforms that can help with doing this. But like I said, the most important thing is not to put all your eggs in one basket. And by extension, if you're opening up on multiple channels, understanding what specific function each of those channels is going to serve.
Great, fantastic answer. And on that note, we've hit 10:30. That brings us to the end of the webinar today. Thank you so much, Adam, for your time. Expertise on Chinese influencer marketing. Thank you everybody for tuning in today. And like I said, there will be follow-up emails, and I know that we didn't have slides today, but we will be adding in some webinar insight slides for this series to the follow-up. So you'll have some extra info there. But as I said, please contact Adam if you have any other questions. Thank you so much, everyone. And I hope you have a fantastic rest of the week. Thank you, Adam, and have a good week too.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.